At their Thanksgiving party, her husband and his mistress mocked her for being an orphan, unaware she was the lost daughter of the city's richest mogul, given away in a sealed, secret adoption. And when the DNA results were finally read out loud in a courtroom, her reaction didn't just end a marriage, it shattered their future. Most orphans should be grateful just to be invited. That was the sentence that froze the room. Not whispered, not accidental. Said clearly at a Thanksgiving table loaded with food and people who believed nothing could touch them. Her husband laughed after saying it. The woman sitting beside him, too close, too confident, smiled like the insult was a private joke they'd been perfecting. No one defended her. No one noticed the way she slowly folded her napkin, or how her hand brushed the thin silver necklace at her throat, the one she had worn since childhood, without ever knowing who had put it there. They didn't see that she wasn't crying, wasn't shaking, wasn't breaking. They thought they had won. What they didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, a quiet phone call had already knocked their future off its tracks. A call about a closed adoption, about a hospital error no one wanted to admit, about a missing child a billionaire had never stopped searching for, about a DNA test that was already in motion while they mocked her for having no roots. This is not a story about shouting back. It's a story about what happens when humiliation is mistaken for power, when betrayal is served at a table meant for safety, and when people assume that where you started in life is all you will ever be. Because while they were busy rewriting her as nothing, the truth was quietly assembling itself. Records, timelines, bank statements, access logs, and one sealed envelope whose contents would later be read in a courtroom where laughter protects no one. Her reaction wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge the way movies sell it, it was patience. And patience, backed by documented truth, is devastating. In this story, you'll see how public cruelty creates private consequences, how silence can be strategy instead of weakness, and how people who judge others by their current status usually have no idea what's already moving behind the scenes. You'll see how betrayal doesn't always end with shouting matches, but sometimes with paperwork, witnesses, and a judge reading out a DNA report that makes every previous insult sound ridiculous. Watch, you'll also learn something deeply practical, how emotional abuse often hides behind jokes and honesty, why controlling the narrative is a favorite tool of manipulators, and how dignity, timing, and preparation can dismantle cruelty without ever becoming cruel yourself. This story isn't about becoming rich. It's about becoming unerasable. Before we continue, think about this. The people who feel safest humiliating others are often the least prepared for what happens when facts replace assumptions. By the end, you'll understand the real cost of judging people too early, the danger of betraying someone you think is powerless, and why truth doesn't need to rush. It only needs the right room in the right moment. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel invisible, this story is for you. And before we begin, gently tap the subscribe button, share where you're watching from, and stay with us. Because what started at a Thanksgiving table doesn't end there. It ends where dignity finally gets the last word. The room went quiet in the wrong way, not the peaceful kind. The kind where laughter had just stopped too sharply, like a glass set down a little too hard. The Thanksgiving table stretched across the room, long and glossy, reflecting the chandelier above it. Everything shined, but nothing felt warm. Daniel Long, 42, sat at the head of the table, shoulders relaxed, posture claiming ownership. He had the calm confidence of a man who believed the house, the guests, even the silence belonged to him. Hosting gave him energy. Control always did. To his right sat Nicole Robinson, mid-30s, elegant and sharp-edged. She wore a fitted dark green dress, expensive, deliberate, the same one Stephanie had once held up in a store mirror weeks earlier, joking it was too bold for a family dinner. Nicole wore it now like the room had been built around her. Legs crossed, back straight, fingers resting lightly on her wine glass. Across the room, Stephanie Long, 38, Daniel's wife of 5 years, stopped just inside the dining space. Her chair was gone, not missing entirely, just moved. pushed against the wall near the serving area where plates were stacked and staff walked quietly in and out. Subtle enough to be deniable, obvious enough to feel like a message. Stephanie stood still for a second too long. Daniel noticed. He didn't turn. He didn't look up from his plate. He only spoke casually as if correcting a minor inconvenience. Just grab a spare seat, Steph, he said lightly. Then he added the familiar phrase he used when he wanted obedience to sound reasonable. Let's not make it awkward. Stephanie felt the familiar tightening in her chest, that instinct to smooth things over, to be small, to keep the peace so no one else felt uncomfortable. Nicole was the first to smile. It wasn't wide, just a slight curve of the lips, practiced and contained, the kind of smile that waited to see if anyone would challenge it. Nicole lifted her glass, eyes scanning the table, then settled briefly on Stephanie, as if checking whether the message had landed. It had. Stephanie pulled an extra chair from near the wall and sat where a staff member had quietly placed a spare setting. Not beside Daniel, not near the center, at the edge. The conversation started flowing again as if nothing had happened. Plates clinked. Someone commented on the turkey. Another guest laughed too loudly. The room relaxed back into performance. Then the jokes began. They didn't sound like jokes at first. They came disguised as observations. Casual remarks about upbringing. Comments about how people carry themselves depending on where they came from. Someone laughed about not knowing their grandparents' recipes. Nicole tilted her head, thoughtful. She said something about how traditions were passed down, how they anchored people, how it was hard to build real family customs when you didn't have roots to begin with. Her eyes slid sideways. Stephanie felt them before she met them. Daniel leaned back in his chair, amused. He added to it easily. He always did. You're lucky, Steph, he said. Most orphans should be grateful just to be invited to tables like this. He said it like a compliment, like generosity. Laughter rippled across the table. It wasn't loud, but enough people joined that it stung. A few guests avoided looking at Stephanie. Others looked directly at her, curiosity sharp behind polite expressions. No one stopped it. No one redirected the conversation. No one took out a phone. Nobody needed to. The humiliation was meant to live in memory, not video. Stephanie didn't respond. Under the table, she pressed her fingers lightly together, nails grazing skin, grounding herself. She focused on breathing in through her nose, out through her mouth. Counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. Her hand drifted, almost unconsciously, to the thin silver necklace resting at her throat. She'd worn it as long as she could remember. A simple chain, small pendant, nothing flashy. She'd never known where it came from, only that it had been with her since she was a child. Through foster homes, through new last names, through years of being told not to ask questions no one wanted to answer. Her thumb brushed the pendant once. Nicole noticed. Her smile deepened, just slightly, as if she'd caught a private tell. She leaned closer to Daniel, her shoulder brushing his arm, her knee angled toward his beneath the table. Territorial, comfortable. Stephanie looked down at her plate. Food untouched. She realized she hadn't eaten a single bite. Daniel kept talking. He spoke about gratitude, about how people should appreciate where they ended up, about effort and loyalty. His words weren't directed at Stephanie, but they were meant for her. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. This was what erasure looked like. Not shouting, not rage, just slowly rewriting someone out of relevance. Stephanie listened quietly. She thought about the phone call from 3 weeks ago. She hadn't planned to think about it tonight, but it surfaced anyway. The calm voice on the other end, the pause before the question, being asked if she knew her place of birth, being asked if she'd ever been told another name, a name that had sounded unfamiliar and important at the same time. Her hands had shaken afterward. She'd sat alone in her car staring at the steering wheel, trying to convince herself it was a mistake, a mix-up, a cruel coincidence. Now watching Daniel and Nicole perform in front of his family, it didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like timing. Across the table, Daniel's mother laughed softly at something Nicole said. Approval traveled easily between them. Nicole fit. Stephanie didn't. Stephanie stood slowly. The movement drew attention. Conversations thinned. Daniel finally looked up, irritation flickering across his face before disappearing behind a practiced smile. "I'm not feeling well," Stephanie said. Her voice was calm, polite. "Thank you for dinner. I don't want to disrupt the evening." Daniel didn't argue. That would have required caring how she looked leaving. Nicole watched closely. Stephanie walked out with her back straight, steps steady, dignity intact even as her chest burned. Behind her, under the table, Nicole reached for Daniel's hand and squeezed. Reassuring, claiming, as if sealing something. Stephanie didn't see it, but she felt for the first time that the humiliation wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how certain they were that she had nowhere else to stand. As she closed the door behind her, the silver pendant at her throat felt heavier than it ever had before, like it was waiting for something to be named. Some truths don't arrive loudly. They wait for the right moment to be opened. The phone kept ringing. Stephanie let it ring longer than she should have, heart already racing, as if the sound itself carried bad news. Unknown number. Midday. She stood in the hallway at work, back pressed to a cool wall, watching co-workers pass with coffee cups and laptops, their lives on predictable tracks. She answered on the fifth ring. "Stephanie Long?" the voice asked. It was calm, too calm, male, measured, the kind of voice trained not to alarm people. He said her full legal name carefully like he didn't want to scare it. He introduced himself as a private investigator working on behalf of a family trust tied to a large charitable foundation. "Not law enforcement," he clarified. "This is about old medical records from a sealed private adoption case. The foundation is funding a review of possible hospital errors from decades ago." Stephanie laughed. It came out wrong, short, defensive. She said he had the wrong person. People always did. She told him she'd bounced through foster homes and a closed adoption on paper, and there was nothing to review. She started to end the call. He didn't rush her. He only asked one question. "Do you still have the necklace?" Her hand moved to her throat before she realized it. Her breath stopped halfway in. "I'm only asking," he continued gently, "because the hospital intake report for the missing infant lists a silver chain with a small pendant, non-institutional, tagged to the child's wrist before the paperwork went wrong. That description is very specific." Stephanie closed her eyes. Memories came back in pieces, not scenes. Cold linoleum floors, plastic bins with her name written in marker. Clothes donated in bags that smelled like someone else's detergent. Birthdays no one mentioned. A foster mother once telling her not to ask too many questions because, "This is what you got. Be grateful." She remembered one office visit more clearly than the rest. Beige walls, a tired caseworker behind a desk. He'd pressed the necklace into her small palm and said, "This was with you when you came in. It's yours. Keep it safe." No explanation. No name attached. Just, "It's yours." And the investigator spoke again, voice steady. He said a newborn had gone missing years ago during a private hospital transfer between a small clinic and a larger facility. Not abducted with strangers jumping fences. Lost in paperwork. A rush discharge, duplicate ID bands, one signed form that didn't match the right chart. The kind of error that shouldn't happen but does when systems move faster than people. The child had been listed as transferred. In reality, she'd been processed through the state system with no connection back to the private hospital. The father, the investigator added, went on to become the richest business mogul in the city, publicly private, privately relentless about finding the child the paperwork lost. "The father has been searching ever since," the investigator said, quietly, legally. He funded audits and, on her recently, a project to cross-reference sealed adoption files with improved DNA databases. Stephanie slid down the hallway wall until she was sitting on the floor. "Why now?" she asked. "Why me?" "Because technology caught up," he said simply. "We got a partial DNA match from a voluntary database. It flagged someone with your age range and state. Then your childhood file turned up with the note about the necklace. That's not a coincidence we ignore." He asked if she would consider a DNA test. Stephanie didn't answer right away. She thought of Daniel, of how lately his tone had shifted from annoyed to contemptuous, how he'd started calling her a burden when he was tired, how the words dead weight had slipped into arguments, how he'd gradually taken over the accounts for convenience and then stopped sharing passwords. She thought of Nicole, of how Nicole smiled when Daniel interrupted her, how she watched their marriage like it was a business case she was preparing to take over. Stephanie agreed to the test. "I'll do it," she said, "but quietly." "Quiet is fine," he replied. "We're used to that. I would also like you to speak to an attorney we trust, someone independent from my client. Not for the money," he added. "For your protection. Truth attracts people who want to manage it." That was the first lesson she took from the call. Information is power, but who knows you have it as power too. The test was scheduled for the next morning at a small lab the foundation used for sensitive cases. No big clinic sign, no crowded waiting room, just a coded door, a nurse who checked her ID, and a sterile room that smelled like alcohol wipes. They labeled the vial with a code, not her name. Stephanie watched her own blood fill the tube and felt strangely detached, like she was standing outside her own life. She didn't tell Daniel, not because she liked keeping secrets, because she had learned that, in his world, anything unknown to him made him angry. And this wasn't fully real yet. At home that night, Daniel barely looked at her. He complained about work, about how people depended on him, about how she didn't carry her weight anymore. He said she should be grateful he handled the big stuff. Stephanie listened. She'd been listening for years. Later, in the bathroom mirror, she touched the necklace, studying the reflection of the small pendant. Same face, same eyes, same life on the surface. But inside, something had shifted. A locked door had quietly opened. 2 days later, the investigator called again. He explained that lab work took time, that holidays slowed everything, that they were expecting results just after Thanksgiving. He paused and then added quietly, "If this is confirmed, Mrs. Long, other people in your life may try to get ahead of the story. Spouses, in-laws, anyone who benefits from you feeling small." Stephanie thanked him. She didn't tell anyone about that warning. That night, Daniel told her to cancel her own Thanksgiving idea because family politics are delicate this year, and he needed her to keep it simple and not create drama. She nodded. Then she went to bed holding the necklace in her palm, the metal warm against her skin, wondering for the first time who had put it there and why it had taken decades to matter. 3 weeks felt like a lifetime. The test results, the investigator had said, would be ready just after Thanksgiving. And as Stephanie closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming would not ask her if she was ready. The argument ended the way most of them did. Not with shouting, not with slammed doors, but with Daniel standing in the middle of the living room, jaw tight, eyes cold, saying one sentence heavier than all the others. "You're embarrassing me, Steph." The word landed like a verdict. Stephanie froze where she stood, hands still on the back of the chair she'd been about to move. Guests were in the next room, friends, colleagues, people whose opinions Daniel collected like trophies. She replayed the conversation in her head, trying to locate the offense. She had corrected a detail. Quietly, she hadn't contradicted his opinion. She just clarified a timeline about one of his deals when someone asked. That was enough. Daniel, 42 now, tall and carefully put together, ran his life like a boardroom. Meetings, not conversations. Outcomes, not discussions. When they were younger, he had called it ambition. These days, it looked more like entitlement. "I'm sorry," she said automatically. The words came from habit, not guilt. In the early years of their marriage, she hadn't been like this. When she met Daniel 5 years ago, she was more open. She laughed easily, asked questions, shared ideas. Daniel had told her he loved that she listened, that she made him feel understood. She believed him. Back then, she thought marriage meant adaptation, giving up a promotion so he could take a career leap, moving cities for his opportunity, pausing her own plans, or telling herself it was temporary. The cruelty didn't arrive with one big event. It came in layers. First, casual comments about her clothes. "Maybe something more polished next time," said as advice. Then her body. "You'd look amazing if you lost just a little." Then jokes, public ones, about how she didn't get finance or wasn't built for pressure. She told herself he was stressed, that successful men were like this, that if she stayed patient, he'd soften. Instead, he hardened. He began retelling stories of his success as if he'd done everything alone. The late nights, the moves, the sacrifices she'd silently made turned invisible in his version. Money, too, shifted under her feet. At first, they had joint accounts. They did budgets together at the kitchen table. Then Daniel suggested consolidating for simplicity since he handled numbers better. Passwords changed. Statements stopped being mailed and went paperless, to his email only. When she asked for access, just in case, he laughed, kissed her head and said, "What for? You'd hate this stuff, trust me." She stopped asking. Then Nicole Robinson entered their lives. Daniel introduced her as a senior consultant his firm had brought in to clean up some inefficiencies. Nicole was 35, sharp-eyed, precise, the kind of woman who never seemed rushed. She had a way of tilting her head when she listened, like she was gathering leverage. From the beginning, Nicole spoke to Daniel like an equal. Stephanie noticed how Nicole finished his sentences in front of others, how Daniel didn't interrupt her the way he did Stephanie, or how he looked pleased when Nicole challenged him, but annoyed when Stephanie did the same. One evening, they were all in the living room after a work event. Daniel joked that Stephanie wouldn't understand the tax strategy they were discussing. "She doesn't do numbers," he said, grinning. Nicole laughed, not loudly, just enough to register. That laugh stayed with Stephanie longer than anything else that night. After that, small things changed quickly. Daniel began taking more late meetings that ended with his tie off and his phone face down. Emails became complicated when she asked. He started using phrases like, "I can't explain all of this to you right now," and "You're overreacting, it's just work." Once when she pressed, he half smiled and said, "You keep asking questions like this. People are going to think you're unstable." Nicole laughed again. That was the moment Stephanie realized she had shifted roles in her own marriage, from partner to liability. She adjusted. She grew quieter in conversation, but sharper in observation. She started noticing patterns, not just in what Daniel said, but when. Which topics made him change the subject? Which messages made his jaw tighten? By the time Thanksgiving approached, the dynamic was set. Daniel was distant but demanding. Nicole was present in more spaces that used to be private. Work dinners, family gatherings, even casual Sunday lunches. Daniel's mother praised Nicole openly. "Strong," she called her. "Refreshing. A woman who understands legacy." Stephanie stood nearby, invisible in a house she lived in. On the morning of Thanksgiving, Stephanie watched Daniel adjust his cufflinks in the mirror. "Tonight needs to be smooth," he said. "Just don't start anything. Be pleasant. No emotions." He didn't say, "Because my parents like Nicole," but he didn't have to. Stephanie nodded. She touched the silver necklace at her throat. A reflex now, especially since the investigator's call, and washed herself in the mirror beside him. At the dinner table that evening, when Nicole stood to raise her glass, Stephanie felt it before the words were even spoken. Nicole smiled and lifted her wine. She spoke about gratitude, about being welcomed, about new beginnings and people stepping into the roles they were meant for. The room leaned in, and Stephanie realized, with a calm that surprised her, that whatever came next was not spontaneous. Some people don't raise a toast unless they're sure someone else is being written out. She understood finally that silence had kept her safe for a long time, but it was also the reason they believed she had nowhere else to go. The toast cut through the room like a blade. Nicole Robinson stood without asking, her chair sliding back with a soft scrape that sounded louder than it should have. She lifted her glass with practiced ease, wrist steady, posture perfect. The chandelier light hit the rim of the glass and flashed once, as if underlining her. Conversation died immediately. Daniel's family understood that posture. It meant something was about to be claimed. Nicole smiled. She thanked Daniel's parents first, warmly by name, calling them generous, stable, and the kind of people who know how to build a real family. She complimented the house, the meal, the traditions that give people a sense of where they belong. Her eyes flicked briefly to Stephanie on the edge of the table. Just once. Long enough to land the message. Not long enough to invite response. Daniel didn't stop her. He leaned back, one arm draped casually over his chair, wearing the half smile he used in boardrooms when someone was saying what he wanted said. Stephanie felt the air tighten. The staff paused near the doorway, pretending to be busy with plates that didn't need rearranging. One server adjusted a stack of dishes that was already straight. It was the kind of stillness that comes when everyone senses a line is about to be crossed. Nicole ended her speech with a gentle, calculated punch. "I'm just grateful," she said, "is to finally be in a family where roots matter, where history means something." She didn't have to say, unlike some people. A few guests clapped, soft, polite, enough. One of Daniel's cousins, trying to be fair, turned toward Stephanie and asked if she wanted to say something. The question sounded kind, but it put her on a spot she hadn't chosen. Daniel answered before she could open her mouth. "Steph's had a rough year," he said with a practiced sigh. "The holidays are complicated for her. You know, being an orphan and all that. Family gatherings can be confusing when you didn't grow up with one." He laughed. This time, more people joined him. Laughter is contagious when it protects you from being the only one not joining. Someone looked down at their plate. Someone else reached for their drink too quickly. No one said, "Gary, that's enough." Stephanie watched it happen with a strange clarity. It was like stepping out of a painting she'd been stuck inside. She saw the whole picture at once. Daniel using her past as a prop, Nicole securing her position as the suitable partner, his mother nodding along, lips pressed together in that small, satisfied way. The server near the door looked away, jaw tight. Even he knew this wasn't just joking, but he was paid to be invisible. Under the table, Stephanie's fingers found the pendant at her throat. 3 weeks ago, a stranger had called it evidence. Now Daniel was using the same story, the orphan girl with no roots, as a punchline. Something in her went very still. She stood. Chairs creaked. Forks paused midair. Daniel frowned, already annoyed before she'd said a word. "I'm so sorry," Stephanie said, and voice calm and even, "for interrupting." Everyone watched her now. "I'm not feeling well," she continued. "Thank you for dinner. It's been clarifying." The word made Nicole's eyebrow twitch. Stephanie turned to Daniel's parents and thanked them for hosting. She thanked Daniel for his honesty. The room couldn't tell if she meant it or not. Then she looked at Nicole and added, "And thank you for your toast. It was very revealing." Nicole blinked, just once. Daniel didn't stand. He didn't try to convince her to stay. Stopping her would signal that her presence mattered. He'd already decided it didn't. As Stephanie walked toward the doorway, she passed Mrs. Carter, a family friend in her 60s who had known Daniel since he was young. Mrs. Carter reached out, lightly touching Stephanie's arm. "I'm sorry," she murmured, in quiet enough that no one at the table heard. It didn't undo anything, but it proved someone had noticed. At the front door, the gateman, hired for the event, held it open. He didn't meet her eyes, but his throat worked like he wanted to say something, and knew he couldn't. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp. Stephanie inhaled deeply, the chill clearing the fog in her head. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She didn't check it yet. Behind her, laughter resumed, thinner, but still present. Inside, Nicole would be sliding a hand under the table to squeeze Daniel's, sealing the performance. Stephanie walked to her car, the pendant warm now against her skin despite the cold. She understood something with painful clarity. The table she had just left wasn't where she had lost herself. It was where they had finally stopped pretending she existed. And somewhere between that humiliation and the unread message waiting on her phone, a different version of her life was already moving toward her. The envelope arrived with a sound that didn't match what was inside. A soft thud against the front door. Ordinary, harmless. The kind of sound you ignore while making coffee. Stephanie froze in the kitchen. Her mug sat on the counter, steam curling upward, untouched. Monday morning light filtered through the blinds, dull and gray. Thanksgiving had been 3 days ago. She hadn't heard from Daniel except for one short text telling her they needed to be adults and discuss divorce calmly. He'd sent it late at night. She hadn't replied. Now the envelope waited on the mat just inside the door. Thick, cream-colored, no logo. Thus her full legal name printed neatly, Stephanie Long, in professional block letters. The kind of envelope lawyers and banks used when they wanted you to sit down before you opened it. She didn't pick it up right away. Instead, she took a breath, walked back to the kitchen table, and pulled out a business card she'd been keeping in a drawer. Catherine Jimenez, Family and Civil Law. The investigator had given it to her after the DNA draw. If the test shows what we think, talk to her, he'd said. She doesn't work for my client. She works for you. Stephanie had already had one preliminary call with Kathy, a short consult to explain the situation and agree they'd speak again when the results came in. No retainers, no detailed strategy. Just a plan to pause until there were facts. Now there were facts in an envelope near her front door. She called. Kathy answered on the third ring, her voice calm and slightly husky, like someone who had spent years talking people through crises without panicking herself. Stephanie, she said, do you have the results in front of you? Not open yet, Stephanie replied. They're here. Kathy's next words were practical, not dramatic. Good. I want you to open them, but not before we talk through what we'll do either way. If it's a match, your legal reality changes, but your value as a person doesn't. If it's not, Daniel's behavior is still unacceptable. Either way, you're not crazy. They spent 10 minutes laying out simple steps. If the test confirmed a biological link to the wealthy family, Kathy would move quickly to secure Stephanie's rights and shield her from anyone trying to leverage that news. If it didn't, and Kathy would still help her leave a coercive marriage. When they hung up, Stephanie called the investigator. He sounded more formal this time. The report should confirm what we suspected, he said carefully. If it does, my client has asked to be informed only after you consent. You'll decide if and how contact happens. Consent. A word that hadn't appeared much in her marriage. When the calls ended, the house felt too quiet. Stephanie walked back to the front door and picked up the envelope. She took it to the dining table, the same table where she'd once meticulously planned Daniel's birthdays, anniversaries, promotions. The table that had never been hers in Daniel's mind, but technically was in the property records Kathy had already downloaded. Her hands didn't shake as she slit the envelope open. Inside were several pages, interclipped neatly together. No dramatic formatting, no surprise, you're rich. Just institutional fonts, lab logos, dates, case numbers. Her eyes went to the name at the top. It wasn't just Stephanie Long. It was 3 names stacked in a line. Her current name, Stephanie Long. Her former legal name from the state system, Stephanie Baker. And a third, the birth name she had never heard before, the daughter of Harold Joseph Howard. Stephanie stared at it, her mind briefly blank. She knew the surname. Everyone in the city did. Harold Howard, late 60s, near mythical, widely regarded as the richest man in the city, the kind of mogul whose companies sponsored hospitals and schools, but whose personal life never made gossip columns. Known for precision, not drama. Rumors said his legal team treated paperwork like sacred text. She read the summary. The probability of biological parentage hovered so close to 100% that the lab didn't feel the need to dress it up. The report listed the old hospital, the dates, the transfer that had gone wrong. A baby recorded as discharged to one facility and processed by the state as if she'd been surrendered. Harold Howard's child had been lost on paper and moved into the system where Stephanie Baker grew up. Stephanie sat back. She didn't cry. She didn't feel instantly different. What she felt was orientation, like someone had finally handed her a map explaining why there were blank spaces in her life. She flipped to the second page. There, in legal language, was confirmation that the Foundation's audit had triggered a re-examination of sealed adoption records. What a cross-matching DNA and the notation about a silver necklace had pulled her file out of thousands. Her necklace. Her hand went to it again, thumb pressing into the familiar shape. She closed the folder and set it aside. Then she pulled out a notebook. She wrote a list. Not emotional words, factual ones. Dates of Daniel's account changes. Times he'd called her unstable in front of witnesses. Names of people at Thanksgiving who'd been present for the orphan jokes. Mrs. Carter, the gateman, staff she knew by first name. The text about divorce he'd sent after publicly humiliating her. She added a new section, motive. Because now staying married to her didn't just mean control, it meant potential access to a very wealthy man he didn't know about yet. Her phone buzzed. Daniel, we need to talk. Let's handle this like adults. A divorce is probably best for both of us. Stephanie stared at the words. He thought he was ending the story. He had no idea it had just changed genres. She didn't respond. Instead, she placed the DNA report back into its envelope, then into a plain folder, and locked it in the drawer beneath the table. A drawer Daniel never used because he considered it junk storage. The necklace slipped slightly against her skin as she stood. Outside, a car drove past, music faint through closed windows. Just another ordinary day in a city that had no idea a decades-old mistake had just been corrected inside a small dining room. Stephanie rested her hand flat on the drawer where the report lay. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was evidence. And what she did with that evidence in the weeks to come would quietly decide whose life shattered. Ashian, who finally walked away whole. The envelope hit the reception desk with a deliberate slap. Heads turned. Stephanie was still halfway down the corridor when she heard it. Paper striking wood, followed by a silence that wasn't natural. She knew that kind of pause. Offices were noisy until something personal happened in public. By the time she reached the front, Daniel Long was already there. He stood as if the floor still belonged to him. Coat on, tie perfect, expression set in a mix of sorrow and irritation he wore for negotiations that weren't going his way. Beside him stood Nicole Robinson, not close enough that her perfume clung to his sleeve. Her posture said supportive. Her eyes said, watching everyone watch us. The receptionist looked from Daniel to Stephanie, then down at the envelope again, like it might bite. Divorce papers, served in her workplace. Stephanie slowed her steps, refusing to rush into the scene. Daniel didn't look at her first. He addressed the room, the way he always did when he wanted sympathy, before anyone heard the other side. "This is unfortunate," he said, voice smooth, "but necessary. I've done everything I can to keep things private, but sometimes people change." He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. Nicole added lightly, "It's always sad when someone can't handle a stable life. Some people just aren't meant for marriage." Her tone was casual. Her eyes were sharp. And she wanted those words to land and stay. Stephanie reached the desk. "Mrs. Long," the receptionist whispered, apologetic. He insisted. "It's all right," Stephanie said. And it was. Not because this was okay, but because she'd already decided this moment would not define her. Daniel finally turned to her. "We should handle this like adults," he said. "Sign, and we can sort out the details without making this uglier than it already is." Stephanie looked at the thick envelope. She didn't reach for it yet. "Daniel," she said quietly, "are you sure you want everything documented?" The words were soft enough that only the people closest heard them. Daniel frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Stephanie didn't elaborate. She just held his gaze for half a second longer than usual, and then took the envelope from the receptionist with a steady hand. "Thank you," she said, to the receptionist, not to Daniel. She turned and walked back toward the interior of the office, not rushing, not running. No tears, no scene. Just exit. That unsettled Nicole more than any shouting would have. Nicole had prepared herself to be the calm contrast, the rational partner standing by Daniel while Stephanie fell apart. Instead, Stephanie looked composed. That wasn't part of the script. The room buzzed as soon as Stephanie disappeared down the hallway. Whispers rose like steam. Someone pretended to go back to their computer and immediately texted a friend instead. Someone else avoided looking at Daniel at all. Daniel straightened his jacket, muttered something about getting to a meeting, and left with Nicole at his side. He told himself he'd won the opening move. He didn't know it was the middle of the game, not the beginning. Stephanie didn't open the divorce packet at work. She took an early lunch, walked down the block, and called Kathy Jimenez from a bench facing a small, mostly empty park. "He served them at your job?" Kathy's voice stayed even, but there was a hard edge underneath now. "With the girlfriend present?" Stephanie described the scene, the public comments, Nicole's little speech about who was meant for marriage. Kathy didn't interrupt. She typed. Stephanie could hear the keys. "Okay," Kathy said at last. "This helps us. Public humiliation is not illegal, but it's evidence of a pattern, especially after what he did at Thanksgiving. And serving you at work when he knows you have counsel? That's theater, not necessity." "What do I do with the papers?" Stephanie asked. "Bring them here," Kathy said. "Do not sign anything today. We'll file our response and our own motions. We've already got your documentation, And now he's just given us witnesses and workplace context. Stephanie glanced down at the envelope in her lap. And the DNA report? She asked. Stays locked where it is for now, Kathy answered. When we file, we'll reference your connection to the Howard case only where it's relevant, to show the power imbalance and his motive for control. We're not turning this into a media circus. We're building a record. Kathy's calm was like a weight under Stephanie's feet. Something solid to stand on. That evening, Daniel paced his home office, irritated. I did it, he muttered to Nicole. She'll drag this out. Shush, watch. Nicole curled into the armchair, legs tucked under her, eyes scanning his face. Then stop letting her drag it out. Freeze the accounts. Limit what she can do. You've been paying for everything anyway. He liked hearing that. It fit the story he told himself. Money moved quickly after that. On paper, it looked normal enough. Changes to account access, pending divorce, credit cards canceled for security. A new savings account opened with Nicole listed as a consultant on a project. Nicole never told him that labeling one-payment bonuses as consulting fees was something auditors loved to question later. She'd seen that movie before. Later, when Daniel went upstairs, a courier brought an envelope to the house. A formal letter addressed to him. Honor from a law firm representing a client with potential legal interests intersecting with your current domestic matter. He tossed it on his study desk, intending to open it after a shower. Nicole noticed it when she passed the doorway. Heavy paper, no logo on the front, a law firm's name printed small on the back. The kind of envelope that made her instinct tighten. She turned it over. Legal correspondence about intersecting interests in Daniel's domestic case. At the exact time Stephanie was being strange, her brain did the math she'd always been good at. Timing plus Stephanie's calm plus Daniel's arrogance. Nicole slipped the envelope into her bag without opening it. She didn't tell Daniel. Later that night, in her own apartment, rented secretly months ago, just in case, she held the envelope over the kitchen sink, lit a match and burned it. She watched the paper blacken and curl, then ran water until every charred scrap disappeared down the drain. She told herself she was protecting both of them. She didn't know Kathy already had digital copies of the same letter in her email. She didn't know the law firm's server kept logs of delivery. She definitely didn't know that destroying legal correspondence didn't make problems vanish. It just created new ones. Across town, Stephanie placed Daniel's divorce packet on Kathy's desk the next morning. They opened it together. Kathy scanned it, flipping pages with efficient fingers. He'd asked to keep the house, most assets, a spousal support clause that framed Stephanie as unstable and financially irresponsible. A non-disclosure agreement designed to keep her from speaking about anything that might affect his professional reputation, with fines attached. Kathy exhaled slowly. All right, she said. He wants everything in writing. She looked up at Stephanie. Good. Nicole Robinson woke up irritated, not panicked yet, just sharply, precisely irritated. She hated loose ends, hated variables she hadn't chosen, and Stephanie had started behaving like a variable. The house felt different now. Daniel was distracted. The staff seemed tense. The routines Nicole liked to slide into had jagged edges. She padded down the hallway wearing a robe she'd once found in Stephanie's old closet. Soft, blue, a size too big. It had been easy to justify at the time. Why let perfectly good clothes go to waste? Now it felt like she'd put on a costume from a show that had been canceled. In the kitchen, she made coffee like she belonged there. She did little things to steady herself. Rearranged a vase, straightened a stack of mail, deleted a reminder Stephanie had left in the shared calendar months ago. The domestic markers of someone else's life annoyed her. When Daniel came in, tie loosened, eyes red, she greeted him with a kiss on the cheek. Rough night, she asked. Lawyers, he grunted. I want this done. She won't sign. Of course she won't, Nicole said lightly. People who don't bring anything to the table always fight the hardest when it's taken away. It was cruel. It was also what Daniel wanted to hear. He told her about the public serving, half complaining, half bragging. Nicole encouraged him to stay firm, to control the narrative, to cut off excess spending so she can't drag this out financially. The phrases came easily, borrowed from years in corporate environments where cutting people off was framed as efficiency. What she didn't say was that she had already started calculating how this might affect her. Money began moving in slightly more aggressive ways. Daniel authorized consulting payments to Nicole from a business account, justifying them as compensation for her strategic support during restructuring. Nicole signed the invoices she drafted for herself, adding vague descriptions like reputation management. She had done this before, not with a soon-to-be divorced man, but with companies cleaning up messy leadership transitions. It had mostly worked. Auditors sometimes raised questions. She usually left before the answers mattered. Daniel didn't see the pattern. He liked that Nicole understood business. What Nicole didn't understand, fully yet, was that this time, she wasn't the one ahead of the audit. The investigator working for Harold Howard had already cross-referenced Daniel's accounts as part of assessing Stephanie's financial risk. Kathy had those reports. So did the foundation's legal team. Nicole thought she was walking on a floor. She was actually walking on glass that had already cracked. The panic started small. An email bounced, not spam, a message Nicole had sent to an old colleague, fishing for reassurance and perhaps a side job consulting on messaging. The reply came back from the server, address no longer in use. Fine. People moved on. Then a call went unanswered. And then another. Then a former client she trusted sent a short text. There's talk around that a divorce case you're adjacent to has some complications. Might be wise to keep a low profile for a while. No details. No names. But Nicole knew which divorce case that meant. That night she lay awake in Daniel's bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She slid out quietly at 2 a.m. and padded down to his office. The study was a mess of folders and half-drunk coffee cups. Daniel's laptop glowed with spreadsheets. Nicole didn't touch it. She knew better than to leave traces on devices that weren't hers. But she noticed something on the corner of the desk. A printed email, partially under a legal pad. She pulled it free. It was from a law firm she recognized by reputation, addressed to Daniel's attorney. It mentioned, what in professional understatement, the emerging matter involving Mr. Harold Howard and Miss Stephanie Long, and the need to approach any negotiations with full awareness of our client's capacity and readiness to intervene if necessary. Nicole's mouth went dry. Harold Howard. So that's what had been in the envelope she'd burned. She read the paragraph twice, carefully. Stephanie, Harold, capacity to intervene. This wasn't just some random wealthy parent. This was a man whose name opened and closed doors in the city without press releases. He was capacity, not celebrity. Nicole had spent years trying to climb into circles like that from the outside. If Stephanie had that backing now, even quietly, this whole game had changed. She slid the paper back exactly where she'd found it. For a moment, she considered telling Daniel. Once they could strategize, spin it, pretend ignorance. But Daniel's instinct, when threatened, was to push harder, attack, demand. That was the worst possible move against someone like Harold, and Harold's people already knew her name from the financial reports. Nicole had survived corporate audits. She knew when a ship was taking on water. The next week she began packing, not dramatically. A pair of shoes here, files on a flash drive there, jewelry in a pocket. She told Daniel she was staying at her place a bit more because his stress was affecting her sleep. He believed her. He needed the story where she stayed. She, on the other hand, needed distance. She moved more of her things to the apartment no one knew about, shifted some of the consulting fees into an account in a different bank. Wouldn't stop giving Daniel advice on anything financial. When he complained about Stephanie dragging it out, Nicole just said, "Then let your lawyer handle it. I don't need the details." Her replies to his text grew shorter, then slower. Then one morning she left before dawn, heels in her hand, closing the front door of his house as quietly as she could. She didn't look back. There was no dramatic breakup speech, no final insult, just absence. Nicole had miscounted power. She thought it came from being next to the man at the head of the table. It turned out, in this story, power belonged to the woman everyone thought had nowhere else to go, and to the father who'd never stopped looking for her. The gavel cracked through the courtroom like a starting gun. All rise. The room smelled faintly of paper and old wood. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Courtrooms on television look glamorous or terrifying. This one looked efficient, functional, built for decisions, not drama. Stephanie sat at the petitioner's table, back straight, hands folded. She wore a simple dark dress and a blazer that fit well. No drama, no theatrics. The silver necklace rested where it always did, just visible above the neckline. Beside her, Kathy organized her files with calm precision. Tabbed sections, color-coded flags. A printed copy of the DNA report sat in a folder marked Exhibit. Not on top, not hidden, waiting. Across the aisle, Daniel Long sat with his attorney. He looked smaller than he had at the head of his Thanksgiving table. His suit was sharp, but his posture sagged, like someone had turned down the volume on whatever used to power him. He kept checking the door, as if by some miracle Nicole might stroll in to reassure him. She didn't. The judge settled in, glanced at the docket, and began. This wasn't a criminal trial. It was a family court hearing with additional motions. No jury, no spectators' gasps. Just a judge, lawyers, and a record that would outlast everyone in the room. First came the financials. Kathy walked the court through bank statements showing Daniel consolidating accounts, canceling Stephanie's access, labeling card limits as necessary controls, while maintaining a higher standard of living for himself and Nicole. She pointed to dates, how restrictions tightened after arguments, after Stephanie questioned him, after the investigator's call. Daniel's lawyer objected to relevance. The judge overruled. A coercive control was relevant in a divorce where one party claimed the other was unstable. Then came testimony. Mrs. Carter, hair pulled into a neat bun, took the stand. She spoke quietly but clearly about Thanksgiving, about the moved chair, the jokes about orphans, the way Stephanie left with calm dignity. "It didn't sit right with me," she said. "I still think about it." A member of the catering staff testified by video, confirming the seating change had been requested by Daniel's mother and approved by Daniel. He'd heard the orphan comment too. "I'm not here to take sides," the young man said nervously, but it wasn't a joke to her. You could tell. Daniel shifted in his seat. He hadn't expected the smallest people in the room, the server, the gateman, the older family friend, to matter this much. Kathy didn't raise her voice once, because she let timestamps, phrases, and patterns speak. A text where Daniel called Stephanie dead weight. An email to a friend describing her as emotionally fragile and financially clueless. Sent the same week he'd cut off her card. Then when the narrative had been laid out, Kathy turned to the folder marked Exhibit. "Your Honor," she said, "we have one final piece of evidence. For context, not for financial greed. This goes to motive and to why Mr. Long intensified control at a particular point in time." She submitted the DNA report indicating that Stephanie, formerly known legally as Stephanie Baker, was the biological child of Harold Howard. The judge read the summary silently first. The courtroom stayed very, very quiet. Then for the record, he read the key lines aloud. "This document confirms, to a very high degree of scientific certainty, that Mrs. Long is the biological daughter of Mr. Harold Howard present." A man seated quietly in the second row stood. Harold Howard looked exactly like the kind of person Daniel had once wanted to impress. Controlled, understated, eyes that missed nothing. He nodded once. "I'm here as an observer today, Your Honor," he said. "I'm not a party to these proceedings, and I'm not asking the court for anything." "Noted," the judge replied. "His presence is acknowledged. The court will consider this evidence only as it relates to power dynamics and motive, not inheritance, which is outside the scope of this hearing." For Daniel, it was the moment the future he'd scripted. Successful husband, controlled wife, respectable public image, fractured into something he no longer controlled. Every joke, in every restriction, every public humiliation was now tied, on paper, to the lost daughter of the city's richest mogul. Daniel's face drained of color. He had imagined that if Stephanie were connected to money, he could spin it, present himself as her loyal husband, position himself as bridge between worlds. Instead, the narrative on record was this. He had mocked her for being an orphan weeks after her origin search had begun, tightened financial control as her legal position strengthened, and tried to silence her with an NDA. The judge turned to Stephanie. Mrs. Long, do you wish to make a statement before I rule? She hadn't been required to speak. Kathy had told her she could let the evidence stand without her voice. But Stephanie stood. She turned slightly. I'd enough to face the judge while still seeing the courtroom in her peripheral vision. My husband, she began, voice steady, has told a lot of stories about me over the years. That I was unstable, ungrateful, that he carried everything. She paused. For a long time, I believed my value came from keeping him comfortable, staying quiet so he could be loud, letting him define what was normal. She didn't look at Daniel. In the last months, I learned two things at the same time, she continued. First, that my life began in a way I was never told the truth about. And second, that my husband felt safer humiliating me in public than respecting me in private. She took a breath. I'm not here to punish him. I'm here because I don't want my silence to be used as proof that he was right about me. She thanked the court and sat down. As the judge nodded once, made a few notes, and then delivered the ruling, the marriage was dissolved. Stephanie was granted a fair share of marital assets and protected support. The court noted Daniel's pattern of financial restriction and emotional belittling as coercive behavior, not normal marital conflict. The NDA language he'd proposed was rejected as overreaching. As for the DNA, the court acknowledges, the judge said, that Mrs. Long's newly established biological connection to Mr. Howard may further change her financial circumstances outside this courtroom. This fact, however, only underscores the inappropriateness of Mr. Long's attempts to undermine her stability and autonomy. The gavel came down. Case adjourned. People stood, the room filling with the rustle of bags and clothing. Harold did not rush to Stephanie. He waited, letting the attorneys leave, letting Daniel disappear down the hallway with his lawyer buzzing in his ear. When Stephanie finally stepped outside the courthouse doors, reporters waited. Microphones, phones, flashes. Mrs. Long, is it true? Are you really? How does it feel to be? She lifted one hand slightly. I'm not making statements today, she said. Thank you. She kept walking. Her silence this time was not permission. It was choice. The first call came at 6:12 a.m. Daniel stared at his ringing phone on the bedside table, the screen lighting his half-dark room. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway. Old habits. Deals started early. Daniel, the voice said, a partner, older, careful. Given recent developments, the board has decided it's best if you step back from client-facing roles for the time being. Optics? You understand. I don't, Daniel said. His voice sounded hoarse even to his own ears. This is my firm. There was a pause. Optics, the man repeated gently and hung up. The second call came mid-morning. Another partner, same tone, different wording. They would review his equity position over the next quarter. They appreciated his past contributions. By noon, Daniel stopped answering unknown numbers. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where Stephanie used to leave sticky notes. She'd stopped doing that months before Thanksgiving. He hadn't noticed when the last note disappeared. His email inbox was full, not of support, of distance. My clients who had once praised his decisiveness now wrote that they were reassessing engagement until internal matters settled. An internal HR memo requested his response to a complaint filed by a junior employee about hostile remarks and public belittlement, phrased carefully but clearly about him. Someone had sent a link. It wasn't a news article. Kathy had kept things quiet. It was a legal summary posted to a subscription database that firms used. The ruling in his divorce case. The court's findings about coercive behavior. It read like a report on someone else. He closed the laptop. The house was too quiet. Nicole's robe was still draped over the chair in the bedroom. Her perfume had faded. Her name remained on some of his accounts as a consultant, which now looked less like sophistication and more like misjudgment. He tried calling her again. Straight to voicemail. He left no message. What was he going to say? Come back, it's worse than we thought. I've lost more than you thought you were getting. He tried texting instead. We should talk. Things are escalating. We need a strategy. The message stayed on delivered. No reply. Days turned into weeks. The consequences didn't fall like a building. They eroded piece by piece. He still had money. He still had the house. No one was dragging him to jail. But doors that had always opened with a single phone call now required time and committee approval. Meeting invitations got rescheduled and never reappeared. Gradually, his name stopped showing up on email chains where decisions were made. The punishment wasn't fire, it was cold. Stephanie's life, in contrast, unfolded more quietly. So she continued working, not at the same role as before. Her employer had offered her a move into a position with more stability and autonomy after the divorce. She accepted, not out of fear, but because it fit the life she was rebuilding. She answered a carefully limited number of calls from Harold's side. There were legal documents to sign, confirmations to acknowledge. The media never got the full story, not from her. Anything public came as dry statements from lawyers. Harold invited her gently to his home once for a small dinner with his sister and a few longtime trustees. It was more awkward than magical. No one tried to pretend decades hadn't passed. After everyone left, Harold asked her, "Do you want any of this to be big?" She understood what he meant. Press conferences, public acknowledgments, had the story of the lost daughter splashed across headlines. "No," she said simply. "I don't need the world to know to believe it's real." He nodded, relieved. "Good," he said. "I don't like big." They agreed to proceed like adults who had met late. Slowly, honestly. No sudden declarations. No forced intimacy. Just presence and possibility. The money, when it began to move, wasn't a lottery. It was structured, trusts, advisors, safeguards to prevent anyone, from Daniel, from opportunists, even from future versions of herself, from using it in ways that didn't match what she wanted. Stephanie hired her own financial planner, not one of Harold's people. Someone Kathy vetted, who explained things without talking down to her. The planner said something that stuck. "You're not lucky to be here," she said. "You existed before anyone found you. Name this just updates the spreadsheet." Stephanie liked that. One evening, months later, Stephanie ran into someone at the grocery store, a former co-worker of Daniel's. "How are you?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Better," she said. It was true. He hesitated, then added, "He's not doing great." She didn't ask for details, but he kept talking. "He hasn't been fired, but he's iced out. Clients request other partners. Upper management doesn't want to be associated with that case. It's not what happened. It's that it was written down. People don't like risk." Stephanie nodded. She walked away with her groceries and a strange feeling in her chest. Not satisfaction, not pity, just understanding. For years, Daniel had relied on being the one who defined people. The husband, the host, the head of the table. Now there was a set of court documents and financial records that described him in language he couldn't edit. His fall wasn't spectacular. It was ordinary, that was the point. Sometimes karma isn't a grand crash. Sometimes it's a slow closing of doors no one thinks to film. The door to Harold's study closed with a soft click behind her. Stephanie stood in a room lined with bookshelves and one large window overlooking a carefully tended garden. Sunlight fell in a square on the carpet. Harold sat in an armchair, a folder on the side table next to him. "You don't have to sign anything today," he said. "I know," she replied. It had been almost a year since the court ruling, enough time for the initial shock to settle, enough time for them to test what this new connection meant. They had met several times since the hearing, sometimes with lawyers, sometimes for coffee. They were not pretending to be father and daughter in the way of TV reunions, all tears and instant bond. They were two people carefully touching the edges of a shared truth. Harold gestured toward the folder. "That's the updated trust language," he said. "It clarifies your rights. It also allows you to refuse anything you don't want without cutting you off. I don't want money to become another form of control in your life." Stephanie appreciated how blunt he was. "I'm not used to choices coming with this much paper," she said, half smiling. He chuckled. "You and me both," he said. "I built this life using paper. It's only fair that I try not to bury you in it now." They sat in companionable silence for a minute. "Connie, can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "If this had all come out when I was still married to Daniel," she asked quietly, "what would you have done?" Harold considered his answer. "I would have asked you the same question I'll always ask," he said. "What do you want?" Then I would have hired more lawyers than he has friends. Stephanie laughed softly. The image pleased her. I'm glad it didn't go that way, she said. Me too, he agreed. This way you came here as yourself, not as someone's wife. He didn't push her to change her name. People around them occasionally suggested it, out of tradition, habit, or their own ideas of symbolism. Stephanie kept Stephanie Long on legal documents until the divorce was final. Then she kept Stephanie Baker on others where it suited her. She added her birth name in some contexts. It was messy, but it was her mess. Names, she realized, carried history, not worth. She wasn't going to erase one version of herself to prove the new one was real. The next Thanksgiving, she hosted, not in a mansion, in her own place, a bit bigger now, in a safer neighborhood, with a table she had bought herself. The guest list was small. Mrs. Carter came, carrying a homemade dish and apologizing for getting old and slow, then proving she still had sharper eyes than most people in their 20s. A few co-workers arrived with drinks and desserts. One of Kathy's paralegals brought a board game that turned surprisingly competitive. Harold came too. He arrived with no entourage, wearing a simple sweater instead of a suit. He brought a pie he admitted he hadn't baked himself. I'm good with numbers, he said. Not ovens. No one at the table treated him like a celebrity. They treated him like a slightly awkward, well-meaning older man who was learning how to join a group that existed before he walked in. At one point, someone asked Stephanie what she was most grateful for this year. The question was casual, asked between bites with no pressure for a profound answer. She thought about it for a moment. I'm grateful I learned the difference between survival and living, she said. They waited. In my marriage, and she continued, I thought keeping the peace was the same as being safe. I thought that if I stayed quiet and grateful, things would eventually feel like home. She glanced around the table. Now I know home is where I'm not afraid of my own voice. Silence followed, but a warm one. Someone squeezed her shoulder. You want? Carter dabbed her eyes discreetly. Harold watched her with a look that wasn't pride exactly, more like relief. Relief that the child he'd lost had found herself without needing him to be the hero of her story. Later that night, after everyone left and the dishes were done, Stephanie stood by her window again. The city lights blinked softly. Her reflection in the glass looked calmer than it had a year ago. The necklace rested against her skin, still the one constant that had followed her from hospital to foster homes to this apartment. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a message from Kathy. All done. Final paperwork filed. Officially closed. You're free to ignore it all now if you'd like. Stephanie smiled. She turned off the kitchen light and headed toward her bedroom. Even the faint outline of the dining table still visible in the dark behind her. A table where no one would move her chair to the wall again. Some endings look like losing everything. Others look like finally having enough space to decide who you are without anyone else's permission. Stephanie hadn't just survived, she'd chosen herself. And this time, no one was going to write her out of the room. Stephanie's story doesn't end with cheering crowds, viral clips, or a perfectly packaged revenge arc. It ends with something quieter and much harder to take away. It ends with agency. For a long time, Stephanie survived by adapting to whatever room she was in. In foster homes, that meant staying small and not asking questions. In her marriage, it meant smoothing over Daniel's moods and absorbing his cruelty so he could keep his image intact. That wasn't weakness. It was survival. But surviving is not the same as living. Lesson 1. Silence is not consent. Stephanie's silence was often used against her. Daniel and Nicole took her calm as confirmation that their version of events was true. But behind that quiet, she was observing, documenting, learning how they operated. Her silence became evidence. When the judge read the financial patterns, the texts, the witness statements, and the DNA report, Stephanie didn't have to scream to be believed. The facts spoke in a language even manipulators understand. Record. Lesson 2. Cruelty rarely announces itself as cruelty. Daniel didn't introduce himself as an abuser. He framed his control as responsibility, his insults as honesty, his public jokes as just teasing. Nicole framed her cruelty as efficiency, equity as helping him move on. The Thanksgiving table wasn't an accident. It was a choice. People who mock someone publicly, especially using their deepest wounds, aren't slipping up. They're revealing what they really believe when they think there will be no consequences. Lesson 3. Power doesn't always belong to the loudest person in the room. Daniel believed power came from being the one at the head of the table, holding the accounts, controlling who sat where. Nicole believed power came from proximity to him and access to his money. They both miscalculated. Real power in this story came from Stephanie's patience, Kathy's strategy, the investigator's persistence, and Harold's decision to search quietly instead of perform publicly. The moment the DNA report entered the record, Daniel's entire narrative collapsed. Not because Harold was rich, but because Daniel's behavior toward Stephanie was now frozen in a file next to her documented worth. Lesson 4. You don't have to become cruel to stop being powerless. At any point, Stephanie could have tried to fight fire with fire, publicly shaming Daniel, leaking half-truths, becoming the kind of person who hurt back in the same way she'd been hurt. She didn't. She chose preparation over explosion, lawyers over rumors, evidence over screaming matches. Her victory wasn't about destroying Daniel. It was about refusing to let him define her. Lesson 5. Where you come from explains things. It doesn't decide your value. Finding out she was Harold Howard's daughter didn't suddenly make Stephanie worthy. She had always been worthy. When she was a child in foster care, when she was a young wife quieting her own opinions, when she left the Thanksgiving table alone. The DNA report didn't change who she was. It changed who could lie about her. Final lesson. You are allowed to choose yourself without apologizing. Stephanie didn't win because she ended up connected to wealth. She won because she stopped letting other people tell her what she deserved, how much space she could take up, or how quietly she had to suffer to be considered good. She learned that leaving a table where you're being mocked isn't rude, it's self-respect. Some people lose everything loudly. Others lose it quietly when the record finally catches up with their behavior. And some people, like Stephanie, walk away with something better than revenge. They walk away with themselves. That is where this story ends. Not with noise, but with truth.